Hello, and welcome to the Video Archive series. In this series, we interview members of the SMU community who can provide insight into the history of SMU, especially from the perspective of their time at the university. I'm Bill Dworaczyk, and today we have with us a panel of three individuals who will be discussing the football scandal of the 1980s that resulted in the death penalty for SMU football. Our panelists include Dr. Jim Kirby, who at the time was Dean of Perkins School of Theology, Dr. Ruth Morgan, who was Provost of the university and in the Provost office in a couple of different capacities, I understand. And finally, Dr. Lonnie Kliever, faculty representative to the NCAA and the Southwest Conference at that time. Welcome and thank you all for being here today as we discuss a rather grim time of the university's history. I'd like to begin by asking you, Lonnie, to set the context for our discussion today by giving us a summary of the chronology of the events that led up to the death penalty being enacted.
I think it's important to have a chronology. The death penalty didn't happen in a vacuum. It has a history that profoundly changed not only intercollegiate athletics, but the institution as a whole. And I'll try to be brief, but also salient in identifying the major events that led up to and followed from the death penalty itself.
Okay.
In April of 1985, SMU appeared for the sixth time before the Infractions Committee of the NCAA, charged with some 125 violations in its football program. The university's team of lawyers defended the university, sought to impeach the credibility of the witnesses against the university. On the last day of the hearing, Governor William Clements, former chairman of the Board of Governors at SMU, appeared on behalf of the university to assure personally the NCAA Infractions Committee that there were no student athletes being paid in the program and that he would see to it that the program would remain Simon pure for the future. Some 5 weeks later, the university received the news that all of the efforts had been for naught. The university was charged with major violations and strenuous sanctions were imposed on the university. The university exercised its right to appeal, which would not happen until August, when it would appear before the President's Commission of the NCAA to appeal the case. The fateful event was in June of 1985, when at the regular meeting of the NCAA, the so-called death penalty legislation was passed. The legislation stipulated that 2 violations within a 5-year period would immediately lead to the suspension from competition of the athletic program involved. In August, the university appeared before the President's Commission, made its appeal, and the appeal was summarily dismissed by the President's Commission, which meant that the penalties then and only then went into effect. It's one of the ironies of the history of the athletic department that had they accepted the penalties in May, before the death penalty legislation was passed, they would not have been subject to the death penalty. And so it was one of those instances where if you believe in a moral order to the universe, the opportunity slipped away, and for justifiable reasons. In August of that same summer, 1985, there was a fateful meeting between President Donald Shields, Governor Clements, Bob Hitch, athletic director, and Ed Cox, chairman of the Board of Trustees. And they discussed the question of whether the payments that had been legitimately and honestly discontinued should be resumed. It seems that some of the football players were stirring up trouble and levying threats to expose the whole system
If they weren't continued. to
if
be
they were
paid.
not continued.
Okay.
In that meeting, President Shields and Ed Cox argued against resuming the payments. Bob Hitch and Governor Clements argued for resuming the payments. There was no resolution. But after the meeting in the parking lot, Governor Clements and Bob Hitch talked, and they both agreed that there were greater risks in not resuming the payments than in resuming the payments, and so a wind down payoff schedule was put into a place. And there were some 25 athletes who had been receiving money who began then again to receive the monthly stipends. In September, a former athlete, David Stanley, who had left the program, went to the NCAA with the information that he had been illegally recruited and illegally paid at SMU. Channel 8 got wind of this story, set up an interview with Bob Hitch and with Bobby Collins, the head coach, and with Henry Lee Parker, the man who it turned out was dispensing the money to the athletes. And in a breathtaking and memorable piece of TV journalism, caught the three of them with their proverbial hands in the cookie jar, although they denied everything. I was at the president's house on November the 12th when Channel 8 had informed the university that they were going to broadcast their story about SMU football. Mark Scharouse, the assistant to the president, Leon Bennett, vice president of legal affairs, and Bob Hitch were also there. We watched the program in stunned silence. It was absolutely devastating. And the evidence had been marshaled, including lie detector tests and handwriting analyses. And it was clear that David Stanley had been falsely recruited, or so it seemed. The athletic department denied the stories afterwards, pointing out that David Stanley had a drug addiction problem and had been kicked off the football team and had not been able to play football elsewhere and simply had a grudge to bear. But that very night of the original interview, Hitch told me that there was a loose cannon on the ship, and he told me the substance of what had been said. He denied the Stanley story, but he and I both agreed that I should report this to the NCAA, which I did. And they informed me how welcome the news was, because they had been talking to David Stanley for a month. And it was this initiative on the part of my calling the NCAA that then set the stage later for the requirements that the NCAA imposed on the university for a jointly conducted investigation. A couple of other salient events. On November the 4th, Governor Clements won re-election in the gubernatorial race, and that in a sense changed the climate and changed the situation. After the broadcast of the Channel 8 program on November the 12th, that night President Shields called Ed Cox and Paul Corley and Paul Hutchins to see if they had seen the program, and none of them had. And so there was an agreement that they would all come the next morning to view the tape. And President Shields asked that Bennett and Scharouse and Kliever be in attendance. Obviously, Shields had worked through the night with a proposal and recommended to the board leadership, after viewing the tape, that he appoint a blue ribbon investigative committee composed of some of the most respected people around the nation to investigate our program. This was summarily dismissed by the board leadership, and Mr. Cox said, no, we'll appoint a board committee that'll be chaired by Paul Hutchison. William Hutchison.
William
Hutchison. I put in my 2 cents worth that this wasn't going to fly, but that's about what I got for that comment. Was 2 cents. To speed now to the point. After the meeting of the morning of the 12th, on the 15th, President Shield called Bennett, Sherrouse, and myself back to his house. And he looked in terrible health. He was obviously deeply distressed. And he said he was torn between 2 courses of action. One was to resign, and the other was to suspend the program for 2 years. He was torn by wanting to preserve his financial legacy. He was torn by wanting to preserve his moral integrity. And he chose to recommend to the board that we suspend the program for 2 years. They told him to go back to being the president and that they would take care of the football scandal. They made a secret trip. The board leadership made a secret trip to the NCAA and said they were willing to accept Stanley's story and to suspend the football program for 2 years if there would be no further investigation. The infractions committee said, no, we got to find out how many other David Stanleys there are in your program. That's not going to wash. That then led to an overture on the part of the NCAA infractions committee to set up a cooperative joint investigation with me playing a crucial role because they had some respect for the work that I'd done on behalf of the university. I never thought that I would do that, and I refused, saying it was a losing proposition. Bob Hitch, who was sort of negotiating between the board leadership and myself, asked what it would take, and I laid down impossible demands. And to my surprise, the board accepted those demands. No lawyers in the program, a full disclosure of violations, complete cooperation with the NCAA, and serious self-imposed penalties on our football program. We negotiated those penalties over the next month and a half with the enforcement staff, appeared before the infractions committee in February. The infractions committee appreciated the effort that the university had made, were very complimentary of my role in this, but within a period of 3 weeks said no thanks. They knew too much about our program on the basis of hearsay and inadmissible evidence, and so they imposed what they called a modified death penalty. And that modified death penalty was announced at a February the 12th news conference in Dallas. On February the 1st, March the 1st, the news of Hitch's role made front page headlines in Dallas. 2 days later, the senior editor of the Dallas Morning News went to Austin and interviewed Governor Clements, and to everybody's surprise, he acknowledged that he had been involved in the wind down payoff system. He had a news conference the next day in which he admitted his complicity, but also involved about half of the board members whom he said knew full well what was going on and were in agreement with the process. The following week, and I think you all will be able to comment on these in far better detail and clarity than I, there were nonstop meetings of the Board of Trustees that led to the dissolution of the board and the reorganization of the board, the appointment of a bishops committee to investigate the athletic department, and a Blue Ribbon University Committee to decide the fate of intercollegiate athletics. And in late May, Kenneth Pye from Duke University was appointed as the president of Southern Methodist University.
So a tremendous amount of effort and gruesome kind of meetings were going on, I guess, during this whole time. So it must have been fascinating, but difficult, to say the least, to be involved in all of this. Ruth, could you tell us, from your perspective, some of the key events that you remember during this time that led up to this event?
Yes, I was not involved nearly as long as Lonnie was because he was the athletic representative. The key dates for me really begin with President Shields' resignation. I had been in administration for a number of years and had returned to faculty at about this time and did not know that all of these events were transpiring until the announcement on television of the David Stanley case in early November, I believe it was. And then on November 21, President Shields resigned. And this set off a series of changes in administration, and I was asked to come back and serve as the interim provost initially. And when I did so, again, the athletic events were somewhat divorced from my portfolio of responsibilities as chief academic officer of the university.
Right.
And a number of things were going along on parallel tracks. For example, when Shields resigned, a presidential search committee was established for a new president, chaired by Ray Hunt, and I was serving on that committee. And there were a number of problems that had to be addressed, such as re-looking at all of our admissions of athletes. The admissions department, the registration division, and the registrar's office and financial aid was moved into the provost's office at that time as a result, really, of the revelation of these of the scandal. Following that, events in the athletic area pretty much went on their own course for us in the academic side of the house because we felt that this was all, over-enthusiastic boosters and alumni. There was no evidence for us that there was anyone in administration who either knew or participated in, and no one in the governing board. And so the significant event, in a sense the defining moment for us, was the March 3rd revelation in Austin at the press conference that Clements and other members of the Board of Governors knew. Coincidentally, the interim president was William B. Stalkup at the time, and he was having a cabinet meeting at which all of the vice presidents and deans of the university were in attendance. Two were absent. The dean of Meadow School of the Arts, Eugene Bonelli, was absent, and the dean of the engineering school, Bob Fossum, was absent. I mention that because the deans and the vice president decided immediately to draft a statement. And at that time, we asked if anyone there in presence knew, and no one said that they did. Later, I believe the interim president had known since December, but he felt that when he was informed that it was a lie and did not take it seriously, as he stated. So only the vice presidents and the deans who were in attendance signed the statement, but all of them did except the two who were absent and the interim president. And the statement basically said that anyone on the Board of Trustees or the Board of Governors or in the administration of the university who were participant in the payoffs should resign. And following that, no one resigned. But I think that only two people in our entire series of meetings of the Board of Governors and Board of Trustees, and maybe Dean Kirby can refresh our memories on that. In my recollection, only two people ever admitted knowing, and that was Bill Clements and Robert Stewart, president of InterFirst Corporation here in Dallas, who had also served as a Board of Governors chair during the 70s. The next significant event for me, not even the February death penalty. Again, that was athletics. But the next significant event for me, and the one that stands out most, is March 3rd. On March 3rd, of course, during this period of time, rumors were flying, and you were trying to check rumors all of the time. But on March 3rd, Norm Hitchcock, who was a sports reporter for KLIF, reported that there was also an academic scandal, that there were students, primarily in sororities, who were being paid. One figure was $400 a night to sleep with the athletes, and that there were secretaries in the departments, academic departments of the university, who were being paid to change grades of athletes without the knowledge of the professors. Well, the worst thing that can happen to an chief academic officer is to find out that there was an academic scandal, or that the scandal was moving in to the faculty student side of the house. For 2 months, we tried to track this down. We had investigators, we had the newspapers themselves were checking. But the unfortunate thing is that this radio tape, which I listened to several times and could not believe that things didn't fit together right, was picked up by Associated Press, picked up by the press all over the country. And to his credit, one newspaper reporter on the Dallas Times-Herald, David Sinenik, wrote naturally it only got a brief paragraph, said that he felt that Norm Hitchcock had gone around the bend in journalism to report something that had not been verified. And after 2 months, the Dallas Times-Herald did report, the first news media in this city, I believe, that reported that it was a hoax. We had discovered that this was all a hoax, and one of the reasons that they had been able to find so much detail from the administrative floor at the university, the second floor of Perkins, was that one of the secretaries on the floor had been having an affair with David Lerner, who turned out to be the perpetrator of the hoax. And she was the one who had called Norm Hitchcock. And so this 2-month period was sort of a surreal period of not knowing if it was true and not knowing if it was not. And yet at the same time, it seems as though when a cloud is over the university and over a program, all kinds of people pile on. And all kinds of events occur that ordinarily might not take significance, that do take significance. And I can recall one, you have to say, you know, what next is going to happen. I had invited the Reverend Walker Rayleigh to be the baccalaureate speaker that year. And in the course of this month, in April, he was under police protection, and his wife was in a vegetative state by having been beaten in the garage, and he was under suspicion of having been the perpetrator of this tragedy. And he would not withdraw from being the baccalaureate speaker. So I had to go to great lengths to try to tactfully uninvite him, because the last thing I wanted was him to be on the stage and say, imagine the press coverage of that in the course of the scandal. So it was, these kinds of things were going on all of the time. So I think in May, when we were quite relieved to have the hoax revealed, and quite relieved a little later to have the president reported, the president, Ken Shields, on board, that we could sort of begin to restore some normalcy to the university.
Ken
Pye, right, thank you.
Right.
Some normalcy.
And this was what? This would have been what year now? This 80?
This is 87.
87, right? Okay.
1987.
Right. Okay. Fascinating. Well, Jim, now you were dean, so you were in Perkins at the time. So give us a little bit of a history about when you were there and what your.
Well, I fell sort of in between Lonnie and Ruth, because the deans were notified, and I'm not quite sure when, and I don't have in my notes exactly when we were notified of the situation vis-a-vis the NCAA during the summer. And I remember we usually started the year with an informal party over at the president's house, and so we were over at Shields having this party out in the back, and I was sitting with Hitch, whom I always liked and enjoyed seeing around. And I was sitting with Hitch, and I said to him, what's going to happen with this? And much to my surprise, he said, I'll tell you what really worries me. When we stop paying these people who've been paid before, that's when the trouble is going to start. Mm. And that told me pretty quickly that there was in fact something that was dramatic. The other part of it in which I was involved had to do with the president. We sort of in the later part of September were at a retreat, which we normally had a kind of workshop in which the deans and vice presidents, the president was there. And Don Shields was not there. He was ill. And we all knew Don had a pattern in which when he got under tremendous stress, he would fall out for 2 or 3 days. He'd become ill, and we'd know he was at home, and a lot of these things went on around the house because he'd be there and he was ill and was not able to. So we didn't originally think very much about it. Mm-hmm. Thought just perhaps it was one of those things. But well, the last day of the event, Don appeared, and it was perfectly obvious that something dramatic had happened to him, and that he was not the same person that we knew. And I remember I was sitting next to my sort of compadres in the thing were Jess Salacuse, he was dean of the law school, and Roy Herberger, who was dean of the business school. Mm-hmm. And I was kind of sitting between Herberger and Salacuse, and Herberger leaned over to me and said, he'll never make it, he's going to resign. And I said, no, he's just not quite up to par here. But he was obviously not functioning well. And so we go along, and all this business is breaking that Lonnie is talking about, followed by this David Stanley episode. And then we're all called, we're notified sort of on the spur of the moment that we are to come to the boardroom and to be there and not say anything to anybody, but to get to the boardroom. And when I went in the administration building on the lower floor, Bill Stalkup was downstairs. And he was greeting everybody who came in, and he said, Shields is going to resign, so be ready. Mm-hmm. And so we went up to the boardroom, and the deans and the vice presidents were there. Hitch was there. And Shields came in and told us that he had been told by his doctors that if in fact he did not resign, he was going to die. And that it was not a question of just simply getting better, but that in fact he had to leave, and he had to do this for his family. And so he told us that he was getting ready to announce his resignation. And he, having said that, and we were all sort of sitting there, but nobody had said anything as far as I know. And Shields got up and started around the table and embraced every one of us. And Hitch, who was sort of at last in the rotation, embraced Bob, and Bob stood over in the corner and cried. And I think that even now, the sense of it and the memory of it was one of those events in which I realized the depth of the distress and the damage which had been done already to human beings and to the university. And I remember having very mixed feelings about it. On the one hand, I was angry about it, and on the other hand, I was genuinely sorrowful of what was going on. Well, then Ruth and I got roped into all these meetings, these nonstop meetings. Of the board, right. They brought us in, and I remember that the Council of Deans, which normally met 9, 10 times a year, met over 50 times that year.
And what year would this be again now?
That was 86.
86,
No, I think
87.
it was 86, 87.
86, 87,
Yeah.
that whole that
Academic year,
academic
86,
year.
87.
Yes.
Okay.
And we'd get a call in the morning. We'd have a schedule set, appointments, things to be done. They'd call and say, no, so you've got to get up to the boardroom. We're going to start meeting at 8:30. We'll be through by 10. You can keep your schedules for that. Well, we get to by 10. They'd say, no, we haven't really had time enough to get this done. We're going to bring in lunch. And so we'd go through 1, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, get back to the office. Nothing had happened. Everybody's backed up. All the schedules have changed. And it was days and days and days of this kind of stuff. Significantly, what happened in this period is that the cast of characters changed. And a couple of things happened. Ruth and I remember vividly, I think, the day that we walked in and there were 2 people there that we'd never seen before. And we had all been sworn to confidentiality, and so somebody said...
this was in the board
in the
room
board
that
meeting,
he's
these
talking
meetings,
about.
yeah. And somebody said, I'm sorry, but I don't believe I know everybody who's here. Well, it turned out to be 2 public relations people who had been hired and without anybody knowing anything about it, and they were sitting in on this thing and with the idea that they would be charged with representing the university in this process. The other thing is that a new group of persons came in. Ray Hunt, Richard Ware from Amarillo, who I believe is still currently on the board, Bill Solomon, Bobby Lyle, a former board member, former administrator in the School of Business, and perhaps 1 or 2 others whose name I don't remember, but I do remember those. And the leadership in this period shifted to those individuals. And we had as much of a governance crisis on our hands as we had an athletic scandal. And where Ruth was saying it didn't touch on athletics, in some ways it got all of us in the sense that we had a governance crisis. And it was clear that the present structure of the board and the current leadership of the board all had to go. And Bill Hutchison, whom Lonnie mentioned earlier, sort of got caught in the middle because he'd been tagged to be the head of the Board of Governors, and so far as I know, was not involved in any of the events. I think Bill Hutchison was one individual who probably didn't know what was going on. I wasn't there. And yet it looked like that he was the individual, and it was clear also that Hutchison couldn't serve because of the present situation and his connections. And so in some ways, here was an individual who probably was not really involved, but who got tarred with the brush. The other thing I remember just briefly was in one of those meetings, somebody said it'd be a good thing if we all went around the table and said, had we ever made a contribution to a slush fund for the athletic program? And so everybody's going around and one at a time, we're all sitting there together, and not a single person sitting at that table said that I've actually done this. And yet Lonnie has just told you that half of them were directly involved, and even I, perhaps at being naive enough, even I knew they were all lying to each other and us.
Now, at that time, were there still 2 governing boards?
Well, yes, because what had happened was that the Board of Trustees in 1963 had allowed the establishment of the Board of Governors as sort of an executive committee. And initially it didn't happen, but gradually the Board of Governors, as the smaller body, took on a life of its own and ran the university. And the Board of Trustees became a rubber stamp.
Okay.
The board was very large. There were a lot of people in the board.
So what you had were a clique of a few members of the community who were political allies, business associates, and social friends. And they simply ran the university. At the same time, I would have to say that they were very generous with their money and with their time. And in fact, one at least has continued to be very generous with his money and his time. And that's Bill Clements. And and Bob Dedman was involved, but he said that he did not know. And he did get Bill Clements to admit that Bob was not involved. Many of Bill Clements' friends were upset with him because he wouldn't identify who knew and who didn't, so they all got tarred with the same brush. But if he had identified who knew, then who didn't know, then you would know who knew.
Exactly.
So he would have had difficulty there too. So then the Board of Governors, you see, was abolished in 87.
And the size of the trustees dramatically reduced to what it is today. and the whole way of representation was changed. And one of the delicate things that had to happen is that an awful lot of well-known, loyal SMU supporters who'd been on the board for years and years and years had to go off, because one of the devices they used to reorganize the board was to say that there were limits that you could serve. Those were in the bylaws. And these people had exceeded, for example, Mr. Cox and Mr. Clements and Bobby Stewart, as I recall, just sort of alternated being president of the trustees and head of the board of governors, and then that term would be up and one of them would change and move to the other place. And so you didn't really have a change of leadership, I think. But with the situation in terms of reorganizing the board, you got a dramatic change of leadership, and much of that leadership is still in place.
That's right.
That's many of these people have continued through. And Ray Hunt chaired the search committee, which eventually hired Ken Pye. So in many ways, Ray Hunt became the leader of this younger group of persons who reorganized the board. Leighton Farrell, who was pastor of the Highland Park Methodist Church, chaired the governance committee, which restructured the board. And I think did a good job of that. He was active in that, and he was courageous, went ahead to do what needed to be done. But I think that if you look for some good things that came out of this, that was probably one. SMU set aside an antiquated, ineffective governing board and structure and put in something that could in fact function appropriately to the university and its needs.
I want to pick up on that, because I think that the drift and the content of our conversation is revealing in a very, very precise and accurate way that the most important thing that came out of the football scandal was remarkable changes in the institution. And while the death penalty changed intercollegiate athletics to a certain degree, both cosmetically and substantially, the far more long-lasting and far-reaching consequences of this event were the institutional changes that came from it. And Jim's a theologian and I'm a philosopher, and we worry about what's called a theodicy of history. How do you deal with the evil things that happen, and can good come out of evil? And it seems to me there certainly were a number of salutary consequences of this event that came out of it that probably would have never happened otherwise.
I think that's right. This was the catalyst for that change. But I also, in terms of talking about the salutary events, I want to touch back on something that Jim said about the toll that it took, the depth of the emotion. On the campus, this is almost an event like other major events, the death of Roosevelt, the assassination of Kennedy, and so forth, in a smaller sense. On the campus, people use this scandal as a reference point, a before and an after, or where were you and what were you doing? And it took a terrible toll on everyone. Faculty members would go to professional meetings around the country, and people would raise the scandal issue. Students would go back to their hometowns, and people would raise the issue of the scandal. And how could a church-related institution be so immoral as to do this? Staff members would take the brunt of questions from people, and the athletes in the other programs were embarrassed, and the doors were closed down in the athletic wing of the campus because all of the coaches had left. So many people lost their jobs as a result. So there was a very heavy human cost that rippled throughout the entire university community. And yet this also caused the rise of some heroes and some villains. And I had commented on Norm Hitchcock, having done the university such a disservice by reporting a hoax as truth. On the other side of the coin, there were some reporters who rose to the occasion. I know that Connie Prezant who was the education writer for the Dallas Morning News, tried very hard to be fair and to talk about the good things that were going on at the university. Rena Peterson, the associate editorial page director at the time, wrote a column on what's right with the university. So it wasn't just all negative, but there were some positives. But the significant was the governance.
Part of the thing that's hard to realize is the degree to which we were in the national spotlight. I mean, I have never had the experience of being called by the New York Times prior to that. And the Chronicle of Higher Education sent reporters down here and spent a week or so and then wrote a piece on us in the Bible of higher education, and we were in the forefront of all those things. And because of the true nature of the thing, as Lonnie was saying, there wasn't really a lot that was very good to be said about it.
Right.
And the questions were potent. The other thing that Lonnie would know better than the rest of us was the day that they did the announcement. David Burst came down here. He was the NCAA official who was in charge. They had this press conference and everybody was there and we were all waiting, and Burst became ill in the press conference and got up to try to leave and fainted.
Passed out on the stage, right.
So we thought maybe he'd been struck down on the spot. But
everything was going wrong.
Everything was going wrong. But at any rate,
the media feeding frenzy was
oh.
astonishing. There were over 200 media outlets represented at that press conference. I had, when President Shields resigned and Bill Stalkup was appointed president ad interim, he and I had a talk, and Bill said, I don't know anything about athletics. I don't want to know anything about athletics. You take care of it. And he really authorized me to be the primary spokesperson and primary negotiator for the university.
And
I
Bill
remember that connection, Ruth, and you will remember this. The board wanted to appoint, they wanted at that point to hire a PR firm to handle our problem, and there were sound thinkers who said the faculty is going to go up in smoke if you do this. So as a consolation prize, they sent the 4 people who would probably be on the forefront dealing with the public for a one-day crisis management seminar. Ruth, Mark Scharouse, Larry Landry, who was the vice president of finance, and myself. Okay. I learned later that this 7-hour crisis management seminar cost $10,000. But I'll tell you, it taught you how to deal with the media in a way that was astonishing.
It was very helpful because in looking at my calendar, from the March 3rd announcement by Governor Clements, I had at least one, and often more, reporters or television events daily.
Yes.
Until quite late in the spring. And one of the interesting things, and the reason the deans and vice presidents who were in the board meeting when the 2 representatives of the PR firm appeared in the board to handle our issues, one of the reasons this was such a problem for those of us within the university, certainly on the academic side, was that we perceived a tremendous conflict of interest, because it was the same PR firm that was also Clement's PR firm and some of the other members of the board.
Right, you were hired by someone. The other thing I remember that Lonnie certainly was in on was the feeding frenzy of coaches for the athletes. You were there for that.
Oh, that was unbelievable. I had prepared the football team that we were going to receive sanctions.
So you spoke to the football team?
And I spoke to the football team before the press conference. I just warned them. I said, don't think we're going to come out of this clear. We are going to receive sanctions. But I made these 3 institutional commitments to the student athletes. One, that we would petition the Southwest Conference to waive the 1-year suspension if they transferred within the conference, so they could immediately transfer to another Southwest Conference school without loss of eligibility. 2, that we would support their transfer to any other program in the country and give them the data that they need, but the same sort of recruiting data that you're after, you know, time trials and weight lifting and statistics. And the third, and it was the most generous and I think the most moral thing we could have done, and that is that we promised that any student athletes who stayed in the program would receive a full scholarship through the rest of their course, even though they were not competing. And any student athlete who went to another school and completed his eligibility could transfer back to SMU and complete his degree program. So I'd informed them. Then after the announcement of the death penalty, I had to go down and face that group again, and they were terribly angry. But I reassured and reiterated the promises. And by sundown, there were something like 60 or 70 coaches from every major athletic program in the country recruiting our football players. It was a fire sale on student athletes. And within 2 days, every student athlete had left with the exception of 2. There were 2 students. The sports announcer from Channel 8, what was his?
Dale Hansen.
Dale Hansen?
No, not Dale
No.
Hansen, the other one. He had a son in the program. Gosh, I wish I could remember. There were 2 who stayed in the program. And so it was for having foreseen that coming, that's why I had recommended to President Stalkup that we simply cancel the second year. The NCAA had imposed what they called a modified death penalty, giving us some credit for coming
what was
forward.
that?
And that
Explain
was
that, yeah.
1 year with no competition, and the second year limited to 7 conference games. Well, I told Bill that we were not going to have an athlete left in the program, and we might as well just bite the bullet and take the whole death penalty, which of course is what we did,
Yeah.
because there was no sense in trying to continue a program under those circumstances.
That was the first and only time the death penalty has ever been issued. Okay.
And I think even persons who are not any better versed about athletics than I am realize that it'll probably never be given again, for the simple reason that nobody at the time could even, I think, have imagined the results of it. I doubt seriously that the NCAA could bring themselves for any reason to impose that, because we're 15 years down the road from that, and every piece that you see, even about our new stadium, begins by saying that this is the only team that's ever received the death penalty.
Yeah.
You know, that first line that goes in the paragraphs is there.
Yeah.
Well, and the very nature of recruiting, where you're limited in the number of students you can recruit to, say, 10 or 12 students a year, it takes you 5 or 6 years of recruiting classes just to build up a critical mass of scholarship football players.
Yeah.
And when you're tarred with the brush that we were tarred with, suffice it to say that our recruiting efforts, when we did resume football, have not been very impressive. And that's reflected in.
Well, I don't think even the NCAA enforcement arm had any conception of the impact it would have on the entire university,
That's right.
on the institution, because many of the press calls that I got are all of your faculty leaving? Are you having trouble recruiting faculty? What's happened to your recruitment of students? And what's happened to the finances of the university? Is anyone contributing money anymore? So that just general institutional impact was overwhelming.
It was.
Yeah.
And there have been violations in prestigious programs that have been so egregious. They make our violations look like child's play, no death penalty,
No death penalty.
no suspension of contests, they've chosen to limit, and not even suspension of television rights, because now television
That's
is the
right.
is the golden goose that lays the NCAA's eggs, financial eggs, and so that's taken off the board as a penalty. And about all they can do is maybe penalize you by reducing one coach and 3 or 4 scholarships, and that's about it. And I think that's reflective of good judgment on their part, because as you say, they had no idea what mayhem that this would cause for the institution as a whole.
Yeah.
Never mind the innocent student athletes that it penalized.
Right.
It penalized the whole institution.
Yeah. Lonnie, is there anything else you can share with us about, from the athletics department perspective, during this time? We backtrack a little bit. Anything?
Well, I think there's one note that needs to be added here, and it goes to the large and high level of rage that followed the press conference, because no names of student athletes involved or boosters involved in the infractions were released to the public. And in fact, no names were released to or given to the NCAA Infractions Committee. I would have never thought that the enforcement staff would have written off on a strict promise of confidentiality and still join in with us in a jointly offered or a program before the Infractions Committee. But they did because they knew, and in fact, at the hearing in San Diego, David Burst, who was the director of the enforcement staff, admitted to the Infractions Committee they would have never been able to prove a case against us. That David Stanley, who had come to them, had not given them permission to go forward with his testimony. There's some question about why he did that, and my own hunch is he got paid more for going on the air than for talking to the NCAA. But it was Bob Hitch who worked out an agreement for himself and for his coaches, their retirement package, who then was willing to give the information to the program and to share that information with the NCAA. But his name and as the informant and the major alumni who bankrolled the Wind Down program and the names of the student athletes were never included in any of the reports or the hearings.
Yeah.
And I think it was that fact finally that the Infractions Committee couldn't swallow. If we would have named the names, and I told Hitch and argued with him that this was going to blow the deal out of the water, but he couldn't get anybody to agree to go along with it.
Lonnie, am I wrong? To the best of my knowledge, Hitch has never worked in intercollegiate athletics again.
He has never worked in it, and he was probably the second hottest property as an athletic director in the country. Never worked in intercollegiate athletics. Bobby Collins never worked in intercollegiate athletics again. Henry Lee Parker never involved in intercollegiate athletics.
Don Shields was never a university president
Never,
again.
Never a university
And he was on a
president.
fast track.
He was on the
That's right.
fast track, youngest
Yeah,
president
very young at that time.
Yeah,
Right.
in the
California,
country when he
right.
came here.
Right.
I mean, these are careers
Right.
that were shattered, and there were people I know on the faculty who cried for blood, and among other things I said to them was, "How much blood
do you need?"
do
Yeah.
you need?" These people
Yeah.
didn't escape
No.
with much more than their lives,
Yeah.
and I think in the case of President Shields, he was lucky to do that.
I was. I would want to say maybe to look for another one of the bright lights. From my perspective, Ken Pye was a bright light out of this thing.
Yes.
When Ken came, he brought the kind of integrity that the institution needed. He was utterly transparent in the kinds of things that he did, and he had a remarkable ability to be strong in the face of almost incredible the things that he faced when he came in here. It was astonishing to me that anybody anywhere would take it on.
Yeah.
He was the right person at the right time.
The right
He
time.
was.
To give stability and integrity to the institution, and so that was the certainly the bright point. And on the other side of the coin, from my perspective, one of the dismal points was it seemed like a good idea, the appointment of the Bishops' Committee to do the investigation.
Right.
And their report was probably, in my judgment, the poorest account and the poorest evaluation to come out of this whole thing. And I never will forget the meeting of the Board of Trustees when the bishops presented their report and to the vice presidents and to the deans. And the editor of the United Methodist Reporter, Spurgeon Dunham, said something to the effect that this was the most significant piece of work he had done. It was sort of a moment in the spotlight that was glorious, and that to me was a symbol of the individuals who also used our tragedy as an opportunity to be part of something bigger than themselves in a spotlight.
And one
Yeah.
footnote on that, Ruth. The bishop's report was flawed, not because the bishops investigated. In fact, they hired a crack law firm out of Austin,
In Austin. Huh?
paid over $550,000 to investigate the athletic program. And for that prestigious law firm and that amount of money to come up with that 30-page pamphlet was truly astonishing.
It's a scandal in
A
itself.
scandal in itself. In fact, the report of the scandal was more scandalous than the scandal.
It was not to be remembered fondly. I must say.
Yeah. As we conclude here, I'd like to take a moment for each of you to reflect back and to give us, from your vantage point, what you feel like was the impact this had on the university. Lonnie, you want to begin?
Well, it certainly changed the face of intercollegiate athletics for at least a decade. There are some indications that some of the reforms in terms of admission standards are being called into question, and one wonders if you can ever keep the wolf at bay forever when you're competing in Division I-A. I certainly think that it did, however, restore a certain kind of integrity to our athletic program, and probably our won-loss record is an indication of that integrity. It's very difficult for a small university to compete in recruiting athletes without offering inducements to the recruits to come to SMU or to Tulane or to a smaller institution. So I think I see some changes, and I applaud those changes. I think we've missed a couple of opportunities maybe to rethink the place of intercollegiate athletics on this campus and in our institutional mission. I think we're driven more by alumni interest than by student interest in intercollegiate athletics at the highest level. But I think we're not going to retreat from that in any foreseeable future.
Yeah, okay. Jim, your comments and thoughts?
Oh, I guess that because of the experience that I had as interim president of the university between Ken Pye, his dad, and the coming of Gerald Turner, which afforded me an opportunity to work with the Board of Trustees in its new configuration, and to have been we were not participants, we were observers before, and we would stand out in the hall. I always felt like the field hands who were waiting for old Massa to call us in to to lunch, but we stood out in the hall and waited to go in and then be told what the news was. We never really were involved early on anyway. But to participate in a board which is actively engaged in the life of the university, working strong in committees, and although the board has an executive committee, it rarely ever meets. It deals only with very limited things, and the board really does function as a board. And the type of person who serves on the board now is different. That is an entirely different construct of individuals than it was in the old days of the board. And I regard that as a positive sign for a maturing institution. I think that had to happen. I don't know what would have caused it to happen otherwise.
Okay. We've got a few minutes, Ruth. You want to
I
tell
think
us
the most significant impact certainly is the change in governance. But beyond that, since we have addressed that, I think I would say that an experience such as this had reinforces the view that it can make an institution throughout stronger, in the sense that faculty members, I believe, are taking far more interest in overseeing athletics, admissions, etc., and a more active role in that. And I'm also impressed by the fact that while we focus on the event that's happening, the life of the university in many respects went on. Classes were taught, students were educated, students went to their activities. I'm always amazed when I look back at my calendar how many events went on. At the same time we were in these meetings, I would go to a Board of Governors meeting, and then I would go introduce one evening, for example, David Broder, the Distinguished Lecture Series, and then I'd go to a Presidential Search Committee meeting that night. And so you had the life of the university going on, and this was just a cloud overlay for a certain number of people, but not the entire institution. Their involvement tended to be more the embarrassment of the scandal. So it gives one faith in the durability of institutions, I think, and the commitment to the educational enterprise, as well as having a sound athletic program.
Well, this has been very interesting, and I really do appreciate all of you taking the time to do this today and enlighten us about some of those events in that very dark time of our history here. So, as we conclude this video archive series, I thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Always nice to be with you.
Always
Lonnie.
nice being
it is
with you all.
good to see you.
Yes. We don't have
Under
the
better
chance-
circumstances.
Under better
Yes, sir.
circumstances.